Hi, I'm Kamal. Welcome to Zero Code Cloud. OpenAI recently released the function call functionality. As no coders, I think that gives us even more superpowers. Let's take the simple use case. Let's say you have a YouTube transcript and you want to send that to ChatGPT and you want to get 5 YouTube titles as a response. Now, with the OpenAI's API, you can send that text and then you will get 5 titles, but as one chunk of text. Now, if you wanted to split them into 5 different titles, you can go ahead and do it using a delimiter and so on. But what if you had an API that you can hit and always expect an object with 5 titles so that you can then display those 5 titles in a repeating group to the user so that they can select one title? That's what this function call helps us do. You can define an object schema and then ask OpenAI to respond in the schema so that you get that object always in the response. Now, that didn't make sense to you so far, but don't worry, we are no coders after all. I'll show you a simple demonstration of how this works and how you can implement this using Bubble.
All right, now let's look at function calling using Bubble. So inside my Bubble app, so I have a sample Bubble application here, and I have a few things set up so that I can explain things faster and easily. So there is an input text box, and there are 2 buttons. The first button will show you how the normal OpenAI API usually worked. And the second button will explain to you how the function calling works. So in order to do this, there are a couple of endpoints that I've created. The first one is the chat endpoint. It's essentially we're hitting the completions, OpenAI's completion point. This is something that you should be familiar with. And I'm assuming that Bubble developers who are looking at this know how to make a simple OpenAI call, right? So we're hitting the chat completions endpoint. And this is like you'd normally do, right? So I'm using the 3.5 turbo model, and I'm asking, what I'm asking is I'm giving a list of blogs text and asking, OpenAI to give me 5 titles, right? When I initialize this call, what I'm going to get in response is this, right? So there's like a bunch of chunk of text with 5 titles. The problem with this is it's a chunk of text, right? So let's see how it works. So I'm going to go and copy this. So what I have is I have an input text and I'm entering whatever copy text, essentially the blog, okay? And I'm going to make a simple call here. So when I click this button, what happens is when the simple is called, I'm invoking that OpenAI endpoint and taking the input from the multi-input as value. And then I'm setting the state of title with whatever response that I get. And then here I'm displaying that function calling titles as the value. So if we do simple call, what it's going to do is it's going to call OpenAI, and whatever response we're getting, we're going to display it here, right? As you can see, it's a list of 5 items. Now, I cannot display this individually, right, as list of 5 items, right, because I'm getting this as a text. So that's a problem, right? So let's say instead, if OpenAI was able to return this as an object, right, I can then display this in a repeating group and let the user choose which title they want. That's one use case of it, right? So that's where the function calling comes into picture. We can instruct OpenAI to respond back in an JSON object format, and we can specify what's the object schema is going to look like. So that's what we're going to see now, okay, in the function call. So there is a second endpoint now that I've created, which is a function call endpoint. We're still going to hit the chat completions endpoint. And up until here, it's the same, right? There's no change here. But what now we can do is we can also provide the schema for the function. So we're going to instruct, we're adding something called functions. And in that, we're creating a new function called generate titles, gen titles. And we're giving it a description so that OpenAI knows what this function is for. This function generates a title for the given text. And then we're defining the parameters. So it's going to be an array, and the array is going to have two properties. One is ID and the other is title, right? So when we're giving a list of, when you're giving a blog, OpenAI can now knows that it needs to respond in an array with ID and title. So 5 IDs, 5 titles. And then we're going to say function call. So we're going to instruct OpenAI to use this function when it's going to respond. So this is an optional parameter. So in the sense that if you supply this, it's going to definitely respond it using that gen title object. If you don't supply this, it's up to OpenAI. It could choose to respond in the JSON object. It will decide whether it makes sense or not. Or you can explicitly say, don't use any functions. So in this case, I'm explicitly going to ask OpenAI to use the gen titles option. I will give you an example of this object schema so that you can play around with it and come up with your own objects for your use case. Here, the input is still going to be the same, right? Now let's go ahead and initialize this call. So in this, what you're going to see is, let me go to the raw. So here you're going to see that it has arguments and then it has a list of ID and title, right? It's responding in a JSON object format. So now let's go ahead and see how this looks when you are going to do the same thing. So here, instead of chat, let's go ahead and say function calling, which is a new endpoint that we just created. Copy the same input here. Okay. And then instead of setting, let's set the titles. And here we're going to say result of step 1 choices, first items, function call arguments. Okay. Now if you're going to refresh this, because we made a few changes. Now if we go in here and paste the blog, and then I'm still going to show simple because we're still going to display it here. Okay. Simple. So now it's making that call. And now instead of a simple text, we're getting the response in the schema that we defined, right? So there's an ID title. So there are 5 titles in each of these things. But in order for you to use this as an object inside Bubble, it's slightly tricky. I think there could be other ways of doing this, but I'm going to show you an example, right? So it's still, response is in the form of text when it is captured in Bubble. So what I am doing is I'm going to create a backend workflow, and I'm creating a new API workflow called gen title, and it's going to take input as the blog. Okay. And then in this workflow, I'm calling the function called endpoint that we just created in API connector. And then I'm going to return as a plain text the function called arguments. And what this does is, because we're defining it as a backend workflow, it is going to return the JSON object for us all the time. Because now in the API connector, I'm doing a gen title, defining a gen title API call, and I'm calling this backend workflow that I just created, and I'm passing the blog. And now if I initialize this, it's going to call the backend workflow, which is going to call the OpenAI function call, and we should get the paragraphs here as an object, right? It's a list and it has an object. So we're going to get that perfectly. Now, what I'm going to do is in the function calling call, right? The function call button, when that is clicked, we're going to call the OpenAI gen title API call, and then we're going to insert, we're going to to the same call, and then the response that we're going to get, because now we're getting an array, I'm storing this as a list, and then I'm getting response 1, paragraphs, each item's title. So we're getting each item's ID and title. So we're stating each item's title. And then I have a repeating group here. And in this repeating group, the source, it's a text format, and the source is the new list that we created. And then inside that, I have a simple text element, which is going to refer to that current cell's text. So now if we're going to like call this function, paste this. And now if I do a function call here, it's going to display each of those titles inside a repeating group, because now we got the response as an object. Now we're able to display that object inside a repeating group. And now users will, if you wanted to, right, you can display this 5 text titles to the user and tell them, select whichever you want. And then you can do this. Is a very simple example. From a use case point of view, I think there are a number of different use cases, right? Because function call opens up a wide variety of opportunities, because now you can specifically instruct OpenAI to give response in an object. For no coders, especially Bubble developers, this allows us to build tiny APIs per our needs using OpenAI. So hopefully, this was useful to you. This is my first time attempting something like this. So if there are any questions, if you need help, feel free to just drop me a note. I'll definitely help.